the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hans, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. It's great to have this audience with us to talk through some of the work that we've been doing in the COVID-19 pandemic, looking at energy use and also energy efficiency. So I'm from the Energy Efficiency Division, and I'm an energy analyst in that division. And I'm joined today by three colleagues from the Energy Data Center, Mathilde Dogy, Louis Chambeau, and Florian Monte. And they will be talking a little bit more about how the IEA is adapting to COVID-19 in the way that it analyzes energy demand data. So there's going to be three parts to the presentation today. And the first one is me presenting on some of the key findings from Energy Efficiency 2021, which is our annual tracker of energy efficiency trends. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the results, but more so the techniques we use this year, because COVID-19 threw up some challenges for us, and we decided to change the way we wrote the report. And thankfully, due to the abundance of data that was out there from new data sources, we were able to look at some pretty interesting trends. Secondly, we'll pass to Mathilde and Louis, who are going to talk about how the COVID-19 crisis has necessitated some changes to the way the IEA collects demand-side data, and they're going to talk about electricity data in specific. And thirdly, we'll then hear from Florian, who's going to talk in general terms about the way that exogenous shocks, such as a health crisis, can affect energy demand data, and therefore some techniques for correcting for such shocks. But he's going to really focus in on the weather impact as an example of an exogenous shock as well. So with that, I'm going to get started now. And the key indicator that we show in our energy efficiency tracking report each year is this indicator, which is primary energy intensity. And that's primary energy demand over GDP. What you can see is that last year in 2020, primary energy efficient or energy intensity improved at the lowest rate since 2010. It was 0.8% improvement. And we know from our modeling that that rate should be up at around 3 to 4% improvement per year if the world is to meet our climate change mitigation goals. So that was quite a worrying statistic to see, despite the fact that energy demand declined and so did emissions last year. Energy intensity improvements weren't up at the rate they need to be if we're to meet those goals. However, when you zoom in, you start to think about it a little bit more, and you realize actually that statistic masks a lot of changes. And it's important to sort of decompose those changes if you're really to understand what's going on. And for this community that we're talking to today, the energy policy evaluation community, it's really important, and I'm sure you're all aware, that you look below the hood of an indicator like this to see some of the changes that are actually occurring, particularly in a crisis, because as we know, that indicator could reflect many things. It could reflect the fact that there was a change in the composition of economic activity, perhaps from less energy intensive activities to more energy intensive activities. And likewise, the weather is another impact that could have affected that indicator. On that note, we, the World Energy Outlook team of the IEA, did some analysis on the energy intensity indicators of the previous 2 years, and they showed that when you accounted for weather, actually the rate of energy intensity improvement was fairly similar at around 1.5%. And it's quite a big change there, as you can see in the chart. And this is something that Florian is going to talk about more in his presentation. We haven't done the same for 2020 just yet because we were waiting for a full year of weather data. But when we do adjust that energy intensity number for weather, it may change significantly. So that's why this year we decided to take a slightly different approach to the previous years. In previous years, we look at energy efficiency for the year just gone by, and we also look at longer term trends. So we'll do a decomposition analysis, say, for 5 or 10 years. In 2020, and I realize I've written 2021 here, it's Energy Efficiency 2020, we decided to take a different approach where we wanted to look at how the COVID crisis was potentially affecting energy demand and also energy efficiency for the year that we were in, which is 2020. And I'll make sure I update the title here before we pass these slides on. Now, That was made a lot easier compared to the last major crisis the world faced, purely because there was so much more data and we could look at novel data sources that were changing month to month or hour to hour even in order to look at what was happening in energy efficiency. And this is just an example of how data is much more prevalent. This is from the OECD, and it shows how mobile data usage per country or OECD country has changed significantly since the last crisis back in 2008, 9, and 10. We now see that the mobile data usage is up at around 25 gigabytes a month in Finland, for example, when it was less than 5 back in 2010. So that growth has been rapid and it's been very, very significant. And as a result of that data, there's a lot more that we can analyze and be able to say things about in a timely way. So here's some examples from the report, and I just wanted to show you how we used some of these novel data sources last year in the report. So first of all, there was GPS data. Any time that you specify that you're going home or going to work through an app on your phone, that means that your phone is able to tell how much time you're spending at the place you've designated at your home, and also how many visits you're making to your workplace. And as a result of that, we could see very clearly from the data that time spent at home increased significantly last year. This is global data, and you can see, or at least for the data that Google is able to cover. And you can see that in April, when the lockdowns were at their highest rate, people were spending nearly 20% more time at home than usual. And visits to workplaces also declined significantly. In April, it was 40% lower and continued to be lower throughout the year. And as a result, the energy profile was changing significantly, and you'll see more about how the load curve shifted, for example, in electricity coming up in Louis and Mathilde's presentation. Smart meters was also something that we had much more penetration this time round compared to the crisis back in 2008 and 9. So the smart meter data showed that there was a significant change in the way people used energy within their homes as they spent more time there. And what it shows here in this data that was coming from a Dutch utility is that there was much more consumption happening in the weekday compared to weekends. The weekday consumption started to resemble that of a weekend. And you saw some changes in activities for things like EV charging, for example, which declined because people were commuting less. So for the first time, we were able to get a much more disaggregated picture of how people were using energy in their homes, which wasn't possible before we had smart meters like this. We also made use of smartphone app data, and this is data that comes from Apple. It's trip requests made through their Maps app. And what you can see is that this data gives us a good sense of how modal shifts started to play out during the crisis. So for example, there was a lot less public transport happening in most countries. It's the dark blue bar, whereas private transport modes decreased, but not at the same rate. So this indicates there's a shift from public to private modes of transport. And depending on which private mode of transport chosen, that could be more or less energy intensive. So if they're switching from public transport to driving, obviously more energy intensive. If they're switching from public transport to walking and cycling, that's going to be less energy intensive. So it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the transport data when we go back and look at transport demand across our countries. Finally, we looked at web search data, and the web search data here is around shopping, and it indicates that contrary to what we expected, which was that there would be a sharp drop-off in investments in energy efficiency and energy efficient devices, it's possible that in some devices there was a continuing of purchases and therefore an improvement in energy efficiency. So with these particular devices here, we noted that as soon as the crisis started, online shopping searches increased significantly for these appliance types. Now that could be that people are using their appliances more because they're spending more time at home, and therefore the appliances are coming to the end of their life faster. It could also be that simply people are having to shop at home because they can't go to retail outlets due to the health crisis and the risk of doing so. But the fact, regardless, what it shows is that shopping continued, and therefore appliances were continuing to be replaced and becoming more energy efficient as a whole. So the data was able to show us in almost real time the fact that in certain appliance classes, efficiency wouldn't necessarily decrease as a result of the crisis, which is quite an interesting finding. For more on all of the findings in the report, I would advise you to check out the website, iea.org. You can see the entire report there for free online, or you can download it as a PDF on the left. And now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Louis, who's going to talk a little bit more about how COVID-19 changed the way the energy data centers started to collect demand-side data, focusing on electricity.
Hello, Louis speaking. Thank you very much, Jeremy, and thanks a lot, Hans, as well for having us today. So I think what Jeremy just talked about really emphasizes the need to align data with the uses that we have for it. And in our case, so indeed, we're going to talk about how last year COVID-19 actually sort of forced us to adapt our collection framework, and how we had to expand it to something more real-time focused. So our focus right now is going to be on electricity data. And first we'll give a very simple snapshot of how so far we had been collecting our statistics on energy, and how we moved to how we expanded this to something more adapted to real-time data in the case of COVID-19. And finally, we'll take you through a few examples of what we can actually observe on the data that we have collected. So kicking off with the collection framework that we have so far, what we try to do at the IEA is really to aggregate data from national administrations into something that is consistent, and making sure that it follows standardized international standards in terms of methodology, so that eventually analysts and policymakers can draw comparisons across countries and also across time. So to do that, you have many steps and very heavy and thorough procedures of data validation. And the drawback is that it takes time. So at best, what we obtain is monthly data. So for instance, today we are in March 2021, and we're currently working on February 2021 data. So when COVID-19 took place last year, I mean, at least when we tried to assess the impact of COVID-19 in the case of electricity on demand, we had the first obstacle, that was that with monthly data, it wasn't really possible to derive any very specific conclusion. We couldn't really afford waiting a month to observe, for instance, the impact of measures such as lockdown. So this led us to a new, let's say, new project where we try to collect real-time data. And at first, we didn't really have a structure to do it. So we needed to think of something different to obtain this data in a more timely manner, and to especially optimize the way we were collecting data. So initially we went manually. So what it means is that we had all those different sources where we could obtain this electricity data, and many people were involved because, so again, many different sources and different formats in those different sources. And there was a lot of work put in aligning all the formats, making sure that we were consistent in our methodology, definitions, the fuel mappings, and so on. A lot of data cleaning and adjustment. So again, that was taking a lot of time, and as you can tell, you always have a risk that you're missing something in the overall picture. So from this, we at the same time developed another system of data collection that is basically built on what we already know from the initial collection framework. So all the knowledge that we have of the data. So in the case of electricity, all the adjustments that we know we have to do, and so on, we were able to implement this in web scraping Python scripts. So that basically help us automate all those procedures of going to collect the data, adjusting the data, formatting it, and finally aggregating all this data in a centralized place. And here is a picture of how we currently work. We no longer have many different people involved in the process. It's almost everything is automated, and we move from the source directly to our databases where we collect and aggregate this data. And the main takeaway here is that we managed to reallocate our time resource from spending time in collecting this data to now spending time in being able to analyze this data and trying to derive interesting things to observe. So yeah, the main takeaway here is that this COVID-19 crisis really forced us to adapt our tools, and eventually we still have the initial collection framework that is going to give us robust and qualitative data, but at the same time we have the flexibility to already see what's coming at a real-time level. And my colleague Mathilde is going to take you through real life examples. I think that's the most interesting part of those data sets.
Hello, everybody. So as Louis mentioned, when we first started working on collecting live electricity data, we started working on 3 different geographical zones. So the United States, the European Union, and India. For China, we only have access to monthly data. And with this new robust methodology that we put in place, we were able to extend our coverage from collecting demand and generation data to collecting demand generation and prices data for at least 40 countries, covering this, very colored map of the world. So this is very interesting because it allows us to produce real-time and comparisons of what's going on in different countries and evaluate the impact of the, well, in this case, the COVID-19 crisis on a country in Europe compared to Brazil, for example. So I will take you through a couple of examples now to show how interesting it is to collect such highly granular data. So for example, here we have the case of France, and we will see the demand profile, the electricity demand for week 13, which is the first week of full lockdown in France, compared to the same week of 2019. So in 2019, we can see, a clear demand profile with the average weekday demand, which is higher than the weekend demand, which makes sense. And during lockdown in 2020, we see that this was completely overturned, and that weekday demand, average weekday demand, was equivalent to weekend demand, showing the clear impact of very restrictive lockdown on electricity demand over the territory of France. A second example of this data collection, which is quite interesting, is to show the variability of prices compared to renewable generation. So here in the case of Germany for 2020, we can see that daily electricity prices are very strongly correlated with renewable generation, and the more renewable generation we have, the lower the prices are. And we can also see another thing which is quite interesting, is that electricity prices are lower on weekends rather than weekdays, because as you can see here on this chart, we can see that prices are much higher on weekdays, which correspond to the green data points. And the last example that I want to show you is the case of Spain, where we can see the impact of lower electricity production on electricity prices. And also we can see another thing in this chart, is that in the lockdown period, which started approximately here, we can see that non-renewable production decreased significantly, because as demand decreased, it pushed demand for coal and natural gas production down. So we can see that there is less non-renewable generation, and we can see that the lowest price here corresponds to the lockdown period, where there is the highest renewable generation. So all this analysis has been rendered possible by collecting more granular data, and it can be put into the general framework of the IEA, and now we can analyze very detailed qualitative information on the annual level and more quantitative data that is on an hourly or daily level. So this allows us to produce more granular analysis, and it allows us to quantify the impact of shocks on almost immediately on a wide coverage of countries. And it also allows us to it allows policy analysts to have access to highly robust and harmonized data that can be used for international comparisons for different policies, well, the implementation of different policies. So I will now hand it back to Jeremy.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to, at this point, mention that thanks to this effort from the Energy Data Center, the efficiency division in the IEA can see a lot of opportunities now for doing some new analysis, and especially as we start to think of energy efficiency in a more broader way, moving beyond just thinking about the end use efficiency of our appliances and our vehicles and buildings, and towards thinking of efficiency in a more systemic way, where we think about how our end users interact with the supply side, and also the fact that there is much more distributed generation happening, rooftop PV, storage and batteries. I think this sort of data will then allow us to look at opportunities for increasing efficiency in a more systemic way, and we look forward to making use of it in our own work, and we hope that it's also useful for some of the audience who are on the call at the moment. So I'm going to now hand over to Florian, who's going to take us through some of the techniques used in the data center to account for exogenous shocks to demand, similar to the exogenous shock we've seen with the health crisis.
Hello and good morning to everyone, maybe good afternoon to some. So I understand you hear me well, so indeed I will drive you through how we can take and account for the exogenous shocks that was COVID-19 crisis hitting in 2020 on the demand of electricity. But what we will see now can maybe be applied to other kind of energy flows than only electricity demand. So I will speak of high frequency data. As we just saw, the energy data center is collecting more granular data, so namely hourly data when available or daily data. So this is high frequency data. And I will introduce you to the electricity demand components. I will focus on the weather components of the electricity demand and how we can look into it to deduct policy effects. And I will conclude by looking at complementary techniques that are applicable to high and non-high frequency data to measure policy effects. So when we look at the electricity demand on a granular basis, so a daily basis, we basically can distinguish two main components, the weather-driven components and everything that is non-weather related, and I call it here economic demand. In the presentation, we will dive into the weather component. And why we will do so is because it can be a very large component, sometimes going over 15% of the demand in certain regions of the world and certain seasons of the year. So it is the first reason to look at this component. It's also an interesting component, as you know, with climate change, you will have more and more policies that will focus on this component and try maybe to understand it a little bit more. So all the policies related to adapting to climate change effect might affect these components. However, it is interesting to look at either the weather component or the economic component. It all depends on the policy you are willing to track and which effects you want to measure. So now let's dive a little bit into more details of what I call the weather component on one side and the economic component on the other side. So the weather component here will be the sum of two things, weather variables on one side, so temperature typically, and seasonality variables on another side. So clearly we can have Sundays, weekdays, we can have seasons, and we can have year. So this, we have these two components in the weather component, and in the economic component, we will have GDP level driving demand. The composition of electricity demand is an important component. If you are in an economy where you have a lot of electricity intensive industries, then your electricity demand response will be different than in an economy where you don't have any. On the economic side, you have also energy efficiency policies that are non-weather related, and you can also have prices. So let's dive now into the weather component and see what it can tell us on policy. So why we would look at seasons and weather? When we have high frequency data, we have to take into account the seasonality. For example, here you have the case of India in 2019, and we are looking at the electricity demand on one side and season on the other side. And we can clearly see that so we are looking at the average of the electricity demand per season, and we see that the autumn average is very different from the monsoon and summer average, and winter average is as well very different. So each season is very well dissociated, and you will have to take this into account if you want to measure any policy effects. Actually, we can go even deeper. Why is it interesting to look both at seasonality and weather at the same time, weather variables at the same time? So here I take the example again of the electricity demand, and I saw how the electricity demand reacts or changes with regards to cooling degree days. So cooling degree days are the degree above 21 degrees in India, because in India we consider that above 21 degrees people can start to feel it's warm and hot, so they will maybe turn the air conditioning if they have one. So when we look at this graph, we see that the correlation between electricity demand and cooling degree days is positive, but it depends on each season. So we don't have the same coefficient of correlation in India for each season. So it makes sense to look at it season-wise. And for example, we see that during the monsoon season, when you have 1 degree above, for each degree above 21 degrees, it will require on the Indian grid 125 gigawatt-hour on average per day on the Indian grid. Whereas when we have 1 degree above 21 degrees in summer, it will only require on the Indian grid 70 gigawatt-hour. So it is important to look at seasonality effects and at weather variables at the same time. So now, how can we use the weather component to correctly measure, for example, policy effects? And in this case, I want to see the the size of the COVID-19 shock. So on the right, on the left-hand side, you have a graph that shows you 3 lines. The black line will be the final electricity demand. The green line will be the weather component of this demand. And the blue line will be the difference between the two. So it will be what I call the economic demand. To measure correctly the size of the COVID-19 shock on the electricity demand, you will have to look at the blue line only. Because if you look at the dark line, at the black line, you will embark weather effects. So you will not seize correctly the size of the COVID-19 shock on electricity demand. And on the right-hand side, you have a graph that shows the weekly difference. So the average weekly electricity demand in 2020 compared to 2019. And here, because we have looked at the blue line, we can better and more precisely measure and seize the effect of the COVID-19 shock on electricity demand, and we can see that it was, of course, quite impactful in the middle of March, beginning of April 2020. So this tells us why it is important to look at the weather component, but actually there is even more. So if we look back and at the model where we try to track the weather component, we said that there is weather variables on one side and seasonality variables on another side. And now if we look at one of these weather variables and we look at the relationship between electricity demand and cooling degree days. So if we look at it, across time, like at several points in time, for example, we can look at it at 3 different points in time in 2010, in 2015, and 2020. So if you build a model where you try to track the relationship between the two, electricity demand and cooling degree days, if you do it 3 times, at 3 different moments in times, you will have 3 value of the coefficient, right? You will have beta 1 first, then you will have beta 1 plus something, and then you will have again beta 1 plus something else. So if you make the difference between your coefficient in 2020 and your coefficient in 2010, then you will be able to track the structural change that happened in your economy with regard to cooling degree days and the reaction of electricity demand with regards to this variable. So this difference will be, in my case, epsilon plus eta. And so this is a way to measure, to have, a measure of the structural change that happened in your economy with regard to this variable. But of course, it will embark several policy effects at the same time. It will embark, for example, heating and cooling system adoption during the 10 years. It will embark rural electrification. For example, if I think of the case of India, rural electrification changed significantly during 10 years. It can also embark appliances and LED programs efficiencies and any other structural change. So clearly, this difference will embark several changes, but it still gives you an interesting information. It will be how your economy changed within this time frame, 10 years, with regards to this very variable, which is cooling degree days and its effect on electricity demand. So now, if you want to really focus on one policy and get the size of one policy, you will need to dig a little bit deeper. And this is why we are now going to see complementary techniques to the previous one. So the complementary techniques I want to show you is a famous one in development economics and in economics in general. It is the difference in difference technique. So this technique will both need to have 2 points of comparison in time, but also 2 points of comparison in the space. So you will need to compare 2 regions at 2 moments in time. And if you have these 4 points of comparison, then you might be able to really seize the effect of one given policy. So here I take the example of the adoption of efficient cooling system in an economy, in a country. And it is important that we are looking at the adoption of efficient cooling system. So I make the assumption that region A and region B are comparable. It is very important. For example, they are in the same country. The same policies are in place. And especially the adoption rate of cooling system between the 2 regions at the beginning of the study, for example, in 2010, are the same. And now I will, there is a policy that will be introduced in region A, which will be, for example, a capital subsidy for the adoption of efficient cooling system. And I want to see how this policy will affect the adoption of efficient cooling system. So to do so, I can construct the model that I presented earlier with the weather components. So I will have the demand, and I will try to track the demand based on cooling degree days. And I will have a seasonality indicator, which is 1 when we are in 2020 and 0 before. So I will track beta 1 in region A and gamma 1 in region B. And I will do the same model in 2020 when the policy has been adopted and that behaviors have changed. And so I will have another beta 1 and another gamma 1. And if I make the difference between these four coefficients, I will have a measure of the policy effect P in this region. So as you see, if you want to measure a policy effect per se, you will have to have, and this is my final slide. I have another example, but I won't go through it. My final slides say that if you want to measure policy effects, you will need to have more micro data. So we need granular data, as we said, with Mathilde and Louis, and we will need micro data, so data at regional or local level to be able to compare between regions. And so this means that we will need, of course, comparable statistics across regions, because if you want to build the same model in 2 different regions, you will need to have the same kind of statistics in the 2 regions. So my final word would be, of course, for a need of more micro data and more comparable statistics in general. Thank you for your attention, and please do not hesitate to ask us questions.
So thanks, Florian, and I just wanted to end from our perspective again, the energy efficiency division, just to say that this is obviously something that we're conscious of and often trying to grapple with as we look at a global level. But obviously, a lot of the audience here will be looking at policies at a national or subnational level, and there it's just as important, but potentially maybe slightly easier even because you have that data at the lower level that you can, at the micro level, that you can disaggregate the effects. I was wondering, Hans, did you want to manage the Q&A?